Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream Fish Survive podcast. Today I'm joined by RG Price and Dr. Robert M. Price. So I guess it is double the price.
Yeah, we're the same guy though, so it's as is
Oh,
popularly believed.
there is somebody out there that thinks that if somebody has the same name, they're the same guy. He,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
there is.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Did you know I'm
Well,
the king of Edessa?
how well how are both of you doing today?
Oh, great. Yeah.
Doing good.
Mhm.
Awesome. Talking about the the mythical Jesus. So I also want to get into a bit about Marcion priority and proto Mark because last time you were on here, RG Price, we discussed a bit of that. Your thoughts on the synoptic problem, your diagram of how you think it could be solved. Maybe we can get into that a little bit and take it from there.
Well, first I just wanted to say I'm happy to be on here with Dr. Robert Price. He's sort of, I guess, the person that got me into this whole topic. As prior to reading his books, I was on the other side arguing that, of course, there was a historical Jesus, and it was the incredible shrinking Son of Man that sort of opened my eyes to the fact that there was real scholarship behind this idea that maybe that wasn't the case. And I'm not necessarily saying that Incredible Shrinking Son of Man is the greatest book on this topic ever, or that it's even Dr. Price's best book, but it happened to be the one that I read that really sort of opened my eyes to sort of the type of scholarship pointing in that direction. In terms of Marcion priority, obviously Dr. Vincent's, put forward some very interesting, several different publications over the past, I don't know, 7, 8 years, arguing for the priority of Marcion's gospel. My view is that the Gospel of Mark, as we read it in the canonical Bible, is probably not exactly the original version of that story. It was no doubt edited, and there are a few things that I think were likely probably not a part of the original story. But it seems to me that narrative really must be the first version of the narrative. And when I compare that to what's in Luke or what's in reconstructions of Marcion, I have a hard time believing that something like what is proposed as Marcion's gospel could have been turned into the Gospel of Mark, because the Gospel of Mark has so much coherent symbolism and so many scenes are rooted in scriptural parallels where you have a similar scene in Luke or Marcion's gospel, but it doesn't contain the same type of clear scriptural parallel that exists in Mark. And I think it would be very difficult to take a story and say, oh, well, I'm going to take all these pre-existing scenes and now find scriptures to restructure everything around. Seems like a much more difficult problem than thinking that the original version of the story was one in which all of these scenes were based on these scriptural references. And from there, as we see in Luke and Matthew and others, those scenes sort of were deconstructed and, maybe modified by people who didn't understand the scriptural references, and then altered in ways that diminished the clarity of those scriptural references. Seems to me much more likely than for somebody to take a writing that didn't have so many of these scriptural references and to be able to restructure it all to have them. So that's the reason why I think that the narrative that we find in Mark must be closer to the original than what we find in Luke or potentially Marcion's gospel. Now, there are other potential issues. We don't know for sure that the gospel Marcion didn't look more like Mark than what we maybe think it did. So, I don't know. All I know is that the Gospel of Mark, as we have it canonically, I think must be a very close preservation of the first narrative like this, because of how closely all of the scenes align so well with these scriptural references, and how the whole flow of the story goes, and has such symbolic meaning with the 6 trips back and forth across the lake that are, paired into these 3 things. And, there's so many elements of it that fit together in such a precise way that to me seems to be lost in other versions of the story.
What do you think of the various arguments or demonstrations? I don't know, that Brody and others have suggested for the so-called L material unique to Luke, because he makes a good case, I think, for a lot of that stuff to be original adaptations of stuff in the Deuteronomic history, especially Elijah and Elisha's stories. So that he apparently was, I think you're certainly right about Mark doing that, or whoever he got it from. But it looks like that he wasn't the only one who did. You do have that kind of thing in Luke. I don't know how that bears on the source theory. I haven't really worked that out yet, because it is as you say, it is a real thorny question, because we have a kind of an embarrassment of riches. It's not like we don't have any theory that makes sense of it. There are like too many of them that do, and they don't agree with each other.
Yeah, I mean, well, like when you look at the birth story in Matthew, there's a similar situation where obviously that birth story is created from a bunch of scriptural references, and of course Matthew calls it all out much more obviously than the other writers do. But my reading of that is, it seems like the writer of Matthew in this case caught on to what the writer of Mark was doing and said, "Oh, I'm going to do the same thing." But instead of having all these scenes sort of quote unquote secretly referring to these scriptures, I'm going to point it out to everybody and say, "Hey, look, this happened according to the scriptures." And now maybe that's similar with a similar situation in Luke. I don't know. I haven't looked at that closely enough. Now, what I do think is interesting about Luke is that it does seem, I think there is a strong case for Luke as we have it having sort of 3 quote unquote layers to it. And I don't know which one of those layers necessarily would have been the one that was written in that way. I think it was Brody that was the one saying that there's, Luke 3, 4, and 5, there's content in there that seems to come from some other source. There's then the rest of Luke between 6 and 23 that seems to be essentially the same as Marcion's gospel. And then there's 1 and 2 and 24, which have the truly unique stuff that seems to have been written by perhaps the same writer as Acts. So there would be this, sort of that final editor added on 1, 2, and the end of 2024. But there is some material there in 3, 4, and 5 that appears to come to be the product of some other hand that was not a part of Marcion's gospel, doesn't appear to be written by the same person that wrote 1 and 2. So where did that come from? And of course, that's where the genealogy and stuff going back to Adam is a part of that layer. And so with all of these things, the difficulty is with so many different hands involved at which point and who was doing which part of it, and to what extent was the next writer that was doing things copying what the prior example was doing, and to what extent were they adding their own unique spin on things. It's hard to definitely hard to work out.
Like they say, too many cooks spoil the source critical stew.
Yeah.
Boy, yeah. Yeah, that's. I suggested to Marcus Vincent that I that it seemed to me that Marcion was in writing his gospel, that he was kind of sneaking a lot of Old Testament material back into Scripture. In his, he had repudiated the Old Testament, not as bad, but as Jewish, not Christian. But
Mm-hmm.
I wondered, is that why you have so much stuff that is similar to the Old Testament and based on it in all probability? Could it be that that Marcion was doing the rewriting and saying, well, we it's sort of like Randall Helms says in Gospel Fictions, that Christians were reading the Septuagint by rewriting it as gospel stories. And I thought, well, that would kind of explain that if Marcion were the one rewriting and recasting these stories as about Jesus, okay, we're not sticking with the Old Testament, but there's stuff too good to lose. But I don't know. But he said he agreed with that. He didn't, as far as I remember, say that in his book. But he said, "Oh yeah, that's what I always thought." So that makes him the author and not just the editor. So I'm
Right. Yeah.
still trying to put all this stuff together.
Yeah. I'm trying to figure out too what exactly where the Gnostics come in, and then of course it's important to try to figure out with the Pauline letters. The Pauline letters are such a mess, and I think they're almost. I've maybe I've even gotten too skeptical of the contents of them. I don't know, but um, I don't. I would say that there's almost nothing that we can point at in the Pauline letters and say, well, we know that this was a part of the original first layer of whoever wrote the first version of these letters. They wrote this. I wouldn't say there's a single thing in there that we can say that that's the case, because the letter collection comes from Marcion. What did the letter collection look like before it came into the hands of Marcionites? I have no idea. Was the original Pauline writer somebody who viewed the Lord as, in the way that Marcion did, as a separate, as someone separate from the Jewish deity? Was the Lord coming to replace the Jewish deity? And there's aspects of it that would make me think, well, that's possible. And then there's other aspects that make me think, well, maybe this person is Jewish and their Lord is not a replacement of the Jewish deity. It is the Jewish deity. But I do think, and I wonder what you think about this, Dr. Price. So in Galatians, where it talks about, I was given the ministry to the Gentiles, and these others are given the ministry to the Jews. Well, why is there a need for a ministry to the Jews unless what's being talked about is these people are really Gnostics and they are ministering to the Jews about the new God that is not the God they've been worshiping? Because it seems peculiar to me that there would be a ministry to Jews and a ministry to Gentiles. And of course, I don't think that any of this was that they were going about ministering about some Jesus guy that was dying on the cross or anything like that. So, what are these people ministering to the Jews about? Because it would seem that in some respect, there wouldn't be much different to minister about to the Jews if, Jesus this whole thing is about, sort of Jesus is the Lord, as is the Jewish Lord. So is that person really talking about um, a ministry of sort of the Marcionite type concept of
Hmm.
a separate deity that has been previously unknown to Jews, and that's why there needs to be a ministry to Jews to tell them
Hmm.
about this God they didn't previously know about?
Hmm.
So that is something that I wonder about that. But and there are definitely parts of the Pauline letters that have significant Marcionite bent to them.
Hmm.
Romans 10, almost all of Romans 10, even though some parts of it are not considered to be in Marcion's original letters, parts of it are, and it all talks about how the Jews don't know God. The God has been unknown to them.
Hmm.
Well, that sounds very Marcionite,
Hmm.
in
Yeah.
concept, that this God has been unknown to the Jews. And there are various aspects, but then there's other aspects of the letters that make you think another thing. And so you know I think part of what has to be recognized is that these letters have been so edited and revised by so many different hands over time that trying to figure out what they originally said is almost impossible.
Hmm.
um, to the point that I would say I wouldn't even say that I'm confident that the original letters even included the name Jesus. I don't know. Maybe they did. Maybe they didn't.
Hmm.
It's possible that Marcion added the name Jesus in. Um, it could be that the original letters were Jewish in nature and talking about the Lord. Um, and when Marcion got a hold of them, he humanized what was in the Pauline letters and added Jesus in where Jesus wasn't there. I don't know. I'm just saying
Well,
we
Jason,
shouldn't put so much stock in what we read in the canonical versions today, because we have to recognize just how much potential tampering could have gone on with them.
oh yeah, you're right, and of course that's why a lot of mainstream critical scholars, even like Jerome Murphy O'Connor, is one. Frederick Bissa is another one, who both explicitly said if we take seriously interpolation theories, that's really going to undermine Christian theology and our ability to even talk anymore about what was the center of Pauline theology. Well, if you don't know really if it's as much of a mess as the Jesus Seminar admits the Gospels are, you might as well just forget it. There's no way to know that. And the and as for the message not being distinctively Christian in the sense we know, O'Neill pointed out in his commentary on Romans that the initial discourse on how there's no real advantage to being a Jew if you're not living like one, if you're not living up to it, but you're patting yourself on the back because you're supposedly an Israelite, whereas there are Gentiles who never heard of the Torah that nonetheless have the commandments written on their heart via natural law or whatever. And who's going to be justified before God? It's not like James, it's not the hearers of the law, it's the doers of the law. Whereas a couple of chapters later, we hear no flesh will be justified.
Right.
The Torah, is this the same guy, or was Paul like Legion, a multiple personality? And so, but if you go with like O'Neill says that part where it's those who do the law will be justified. He says this isn't really Pauline in tone or in content, and he says I think it was a Hellenistic Jewish synagogue sermon that was pleading for on behalf of people like the God-fearers. That
Right.
they're not Jews, but they can be okay. You don't have to write them off. And so is that, I mean, if that was by Paul, does that mean that this ministry to Jews wasn't exactly even Christian the way we define it.
Well, right. Yeah, I don't think that it was Christian in the sense that we think of it. And I've got a couple questions for you that I want to run by you.
Mm,
So I guess I'm going to take advantage of the
mm,
opportunity.
mm,
So one is along that same theme. Um, so there's two places in Galatians and in Romans, which are of course the two big
mm,
letters according to either the Marcionites or the Orthodox, that talk about this idea of the promise to Abraham and all this stuff. And everybody acknowledges it's convoluted theology and this idea that because of the promise to Abraham, we don't have to get circumcised, and we can all be children of God. And it seems to not really make any sense. But interestingly, this exact same line of reasoning was employed by Justin Martyr, but he never cites Paul. In fact, Justin Martyr never mentions Paul anywhere and gives no
right.
hint that he knew anything about Paul. And now this makes me think that that whole bit about Abraham is a proto-Orthodox revision. It was not original to the letters. That was something that was put in by whoever created the Orthodox version. And of course, reconstructions of Marcion don't show that as being a part of the Marcionite letters. So the interesting thing is, if that is true, if it is in fact the case that the whole business about the promise to Abraham actually is something that was put in by some proto-Orthodox revision following Justin's thinking, I mean, that's a fundamental part of, I mean, if that's not original Paul, then what, if that's not original Paul, that's just sort of like, then what's left in the letters, because that's sort of a core part of what is deemed to be Pauline theology. And if that's actually Justin Martyr's theology, then then what have you got, right? I mean, what do you think are the prospects of that being a later interpolation into or later revision by a proto-Orthodox reviser, using sort of Justin Martyr using his thoughts and putting them into the letters?
That's quite interesting. I never thought of that, and it could be. I mean, anyway, I was just reading yesterday. I think in Jason Bedoun's book, the First New Testament, somebody was saying, if not him, that section of Galatians is really self-contradictory, because the ostensible argument is that if we're like Abraham, non-Jews but believing in God, well, we're not obliged to keep the Torah, because the Torah was given hundreds of years later. But the issue is, should Gentile Christians get circumcised? God told Abe to do that before the rest of the Torah was out there.
Right.
What was he thinking? It's like it seems to argue the opposite way. It's surprising to find the punchline that you don't need to get circumcised, when the appeal to Abraham certainly was that you would.
Well, that's the thing, is that it's such a peculiar argument. The fact that Justin Martyr would make essentially the exact same argument and not cite Paul. So you either have to say, well, two people individually came up with the same totally bizarre argument that nobody can ever even imagine coming up with, and they came up with it independently and didn't know about it, or Justin Martyr had read the Pauline letters, but for some reason decided to never mention Paul and never say anything about it. Or the only other solution is Justin Martyr's the one that invented the argument and somebody put it into the Pauline letters, which to me seems to make the most sense.
In the penultimate option you just gave, where if he got it from from Paul, but didn't credit Paul because of guilt by association. If other second century non-Pauline Christians thought, like Tertullian said, he's the apostle of Marcion and the apostle of the heretics, then his use of that from Paul without acknowledgement would be the same phenomenon of Marcion or Marcionites retaining Old Testament narratives, but changing them to Jesus stories.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know if that makes any difference, but it suddenly occurs to me.
Well, it would be bizarre to say, well, I'm, against Marcionites and these other things, like Martyr says he is, Justin says he is, but then to, again, this whole business about Abraham sort of becomes the core justification in Pauline theology for why all of this applies to Gentiles. So he's going to say, well, I reject their views, but I'm adopting this core principle, but I'm not going to admit that I got it from them. I mean, why that just seems very convoluted. Why somebody would do that. So anyway, so that's one issue. Now the other one that question I've got for you about the Pauline letters, and this is how I'm trying to figure out, was this a person originally? Did they have a Marcionite type view where they were talking about a new God and a new Lord that was coming, or are they talking about the God and Lord of the Jewish scriptures? It's very unclear. And of course, it's always difficult to tell between Gnostics and, traditional, whatever you would call it, Jews. I mean, it is almost as if, and I've got my own sort of views on sort of where Gnosticism came from. I think it probably emerged after the destruction of the temple among Jews, and is sort of, if you take if you look in the Qumranic writings, the concepts that they had about Belial or Satan, you've got God. And then you've got Satan, who becomes the Lord of the world. So the world is actually ruled by Satan, not by God. And that is the view that these sort of Qumranic Torah-abiding Jews had. And then what the Gnostics do is they essentially say, well, no, Satan is not the Lord of the world. The Jewish God is the Lord of the world, and what you're calling Satan is the Jewish God. And so they sort of mix. So Satan and the Jewish God become interchangeable, whether you're Gnostic or non-Gnostic. Is sort of a very simplified way of viewing it. But at any rate, trying to figure out which side of this the writer of the Pauline letters was on is sort of what I'm trying to do. But so the interesting thing is, which again gets back to what we've been talking about in Philippians. And in Galatians, there's the two sections that talk about persecution of the quote unquote church, which I'll say church is an anachronistic translation. It's the persecution of the assembly of God. Now, what is the assembly of God? I would argue that any Jew in the first or second century reading assembly of God wouldn't make any assumption that that's not a Jewish body. Jews referred to assemblies of God as well. They considered themselves a part of the assembly of God. So I don't know that there's anything about saying that you persecuted the assembly of God that would specifically designate a separate organization other than Jews. But the interesting thing is that this word persecute in Greek has two basically opposite meanings. It means to fervently pursue something. Now, you can fervently pursue something because you're persecuting it. You're like trying to, pursue somebody to track them down and, imprison them or something like that. Or you can also fervently pursue something because you're, in love with it. So you're, a devout follower of something is also using the same word. And interestingly, in Philippians, the section where this word is translated as persecute, it uses the same Greek word two other times, not to mean persecute, but to clearly to mean to pursue something that you're dedicated to follow after and chase after something. So in the section that I'm talking about, I'm sure you're familiar with it, is where he's laying out his credentials for being a good Jew, and he was saying, this is Philippians 3, 4, where he's talking about, these other people that have, that support circumcision and they have confidence in the flesh. And if anybody should have confidence in circumcision, it should be me, because I was a devout Jew. And then he says, if they believe that they have reason to have confidence, I have more. I was circumcised on the 8th day. I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. Regarding the law, I'm a Pharisee. And then it says, as for zeal, the translation, the way it's written, and most scriptures today is, as for zeal, I persecuted the church. And as for righteousness, based on the law, I'm faultless. Now, it seems to me that what the writer is doing is they're laying out and they're saying, these are the reasons that I was a Jew in good standing. If anybody had reason to believe in the Jewish sort of prescription for salvation, it should be me, because I followed all the rules. I was circumcised. I'm from this, almost extinct devout special tribe from Benjamin. I was a Pharisee. I've followed the law faultlessly. And then in this list, we're supposed to believe that persecuting, quote unquote, the church is one of these criteria. It's one of these things is not like the other. And so it seems to me that what that writer probably originally meant was not that they persecuted Jesus followers, but that they were a devotee of the assembly. They were a devotee of the Jewish assembly. So he's saying, laying out all this criteria. I follow the law. I'm circumcised. I'm from this special tribe. I'm a Pharisee. I went to the assembly every day, and all this. And so these are my credentials for being a good Jew. But despite the fact that I did all those things, I still no longer accept those criteria for salvation. I now believe in Jesus. And so that's one of the two places that the New Testament says that the Pauline letters say that Paul was a persecutor of the church. And it seems to me a misreading of what it was actually saying, and it doesn't seem to make sense. The other place is in Galatians, where it's almost the same thing, and where he says, of course, Galatians 1, you've heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, quote unquote, how intensely I persecuted the church, and I was advancing in Judaism beyond my own age and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers. Well, what does persecuting the church have to do with anything? It seems to me that this person was probably originally saying, you heard of my previous life in Judaism, how fervently I attended the assembly, how fervently I attended Jewish services, and was advancing in Judaism among my more faster than those among my own age, and was zealous for the traditions of my fathers. That's this line that makes sense. It doesn't make sense to say, let me prove to you how good a Jew I was because I was persecuting some people. It's more like, let me prove how good a Jew I was because I went to the assembly every day and I was zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. And so it seems to me that those are grievous misreadings that then became turned into this idea that Paul was a persecutor of Christians before he changed and did something else, which is, of course, repeated in Acts. But that seems to me an example of how these letters really cannot be taken at face value. And I have strong suspicions that those are misreadings.
In Philippians, when he's talking about the perfection he seeks in Christ, he says, I have not attained perfection yet, but I strain every nerve for it. That's the kind of talk you're mentioning, where now he's pursuing something else with every bit of energy he has. I once did it with Judaism. Now I'm doing it with Christ. And
Right.
That makes a lot of sense. It's even in the same document.
Right. So it's like he's using that same Greek word 3 times in Philippians 3, and we would, under the current translation, read it as he's meaning it as persecuting one time and then fervently pursuing the next 2 times. It seems to me to make more sense that he's meaning it as to pursue every single time. That in one case he was pursuing Judaism, and now he's traditional Judaism. Now he's pursuing this other view of salvation. Seems to make more sense. But again, the point being, boy, how badly have these letters been misread and misunderstood?
Yeah, I think that's we'll look at something else in Philippians. The anxiety of Protestants when they read, "Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling." No, it must be kidding. If that certainly doesn't seem to fit the Lutheran reading of Paul that is still predominant in Protestant churches anyway. Some scholars seem to realize now that may not be the point. But yeah, there are places where it looks reasonably likely that we've got it exactly backward. Boy.
Yeah, and yeah, true. Well, here I'm taking the advantage here because I have never gotten to talk to you before, so it's I'm gonna take advantage while I can.
That's great.
So obviously you've been dealing with this issue for much longer than I have, probably much longer than just about anybody around. I find it fascinating the degree to which many people are fixated on the idea of there being a Jesus person somewhere, and that they're basically willing to give up everything just to say that there was a person, even if that person is meaningless and did nothing, said nothing. There was a person somehow that inspired it. It seems that people can more readily accept that there was a real human being that did nothing and said nothing, but at least he was crucified, and somehow that started this religion, than to say, well, this didn't really start with the worship of a person. It started with this concept of the Lord, who then became humanized through stories. And by the way, understanding this concept means we're starting off with the divinity, and we're starting off with all these divine ideas, instead of saying, well, it was just a person that was, misunderstood, and, a bunch of lies developed about him. It's like they'd rather believe that there was a real person around which a bunch of fake legends developed than that there wasn't a person, and that the stories have other deeper symbolic meaning.
Well,
I find it pretty fascinating.
Bultmann said that we can't know the was, the what of Jesus, though we can know the das, the fact that he existed. And therefore it's the charisma, the message about Jesus, like the Protestant liberals like Harnack used to say, that the religion of Jesus was the one he preached and practiced, which didn't include believing in his death and resurrection for obvious reasons, but that it changed to a religion about Jesus, or as again Bultmann says, the proclaimer became the proclaimed, and that's quite a different result. What do you, and that's why I guess for Bultmann, it was the message about Jesus and how he achieved authentic existence, and through him you can too, but we can't really know what Jesus did. We have some idea, but that's not really where the gospel is. It's almost like the whole thing begins with a virtual surrender, but Bultmann still thought there had to be a das, plus. There had to be a factual Jesus of some kind, or this just becomes one more philosophy of self-help. And now that really violated his Lutheran conscience, because no, we have to accept salvation by the grace of God, which is preached in about the cross of Christ. And so you wonder. I mean, it's people have said he's almost a Docetist, and that seems pretty fair to me. Like Tillich, similarly, he said it might get like a sort of Cartesian doubt. He said we might not even have it right that the founder of Christianity was even named Jesus. Maybe he was Brian of Nazareth or whatever.
Of course.
But there had to be a founder, because what he did, whoever he was to originate this possibility of the new being, and so that it had to start with somebody, because it began to transform lives, and it wasn't just an idea. I'm not sure if that's cogent, but it was the same sort of thing. We can't know much, if anything, for sure, except there didn't have to be a guy. And I am told by a teacher of mine from years ago who heard Tillich say, it doesn't really matter if there was a historical Jesus or not. And if you say that, you're in effect a mythicist.
Yeah. Well, there was a guy. His name was Paul.
Yeah.
If there was even a Paul. But yeah. So what do you think about the question of whether any of this stuff precedes the First Jewish-Roman War? When I wrote my book, Deciphering the Gospels, I accepted a lot of the, sort of standard scholarship on a lot of things, and just assumed that the Pauline letters were produced, and there was some Pauline ministry from prior to that and everything. But the more I look at it, the more that looks less likely, and it seems to me that all of it began after the First Jewish-Roman War, and was a response to it to some degree. And the trouble is, the Pauline letters are very slim on hints that they were produced after the First Jewish-Roman War. There are actually a couple of somewhat overt references to it. Those are now often looked at as potential interpolations. But the other thing that we have to acknowledge is that we don't necessarily have all the Pauline letters or the content of even the ones that we have. So who knows what was in the stuff we don't know. But what are your thoughts on, does any of this originate prior to that war, or is all of this a reaction to it?
You mean the Jesus story or myth or legend, whatever you want to call it, or Paul?
Yeah, right. Or even, the Pauline concept of, now our body is the temple and everything.
Well, like you point out, there are a lot of commonalities between what Paul says, and Paul in quotes, and what the Qumran sect, whoever they were, said. And it's like, would you need a Jesus? You might need a teacher of righteousness, but I'm not sure that's really important, as long as you've got the proper understanding of the Torah, as the Qumran sect thought. And it might be that I guess it depends on how plausible you think a celestial crucifixion is as an idea. And I think it is plausible. It's not that far out, or far out at all. Because if you think that's what happened, and there are these hints in the Bible, like in Revelation, that the lamb was slain from the foundation of the world. Now, what is that supposed to mean? Are you talking about something that happened in the reign of Pontius Pilate? I don't think so. And similarly, in the book of Revelation, we've got the lamb that was in Revelation too, but in the scene in chapter 4, I think, where the seer sees the heavenly throne room, and he sees the lamb that had been slain, and all the representations of that in early Christian art show the head of the lamb twisted around so it's looking backward. Well, the reason for that is, and that's the way Aries, the ram, in the zodiac is depicted. Well, that's what they used to do. They'd break the neck of a sacrificial lamb. And so this also implies here in heaven is the lamb that was slain. It just seems to me that, yeah, maybe the whole thing was heavenly and not on earth, and that's how the archons can be blamed for his death, and the principalities and powers in Colossians. So that conceptuality was certainly available. And Paul, what does Paul say in, I think it's First Thessalonians? He says there'll be the shout of the archangel and the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first and meet with the Lord in the air. Okay, there's the rapture. And so we will always be with the Lord. That seems to imply we're going to be in heaven. And not on earth, which is an important part of your thesis, whereas Revelation has a different view at that point. God even leaves heaven and dwells on earth. No millennial reign in the Pauline message. So, you could be right, but the problem is it's all a shaky ground. It's all riddled with quicksand. There's just no way to know, but it would make sense. Now, another angle on this, when you say that it's all happening in heaven, that would fit very well after messianic salvation envisioned on earth, politically, militarily. When that is debunked, then you backpedal to saying, it's real, but the kingdom is in heaven. Look at the Seventh-day Adventists. They figured, oh yeah, we've got the date when he's going to have the cleansing of the temple, meaning the universe. Okay, he's coming back on that date. Oops, he didn't. Oh, well, we were right about the date, but wrong about what was going to happen. He just went into the Holy of Holies in the heavenly tabernacle mentioned in Hebrews. Or the Jehovah's Witnesses, they had the date. He's going to come back and begin his reign. Well, zilch. But they said, oh, no, we were right. We were more right than wrong, because that's when he assumed his heavenly reign. So it happened. It's like Clinton said, it depends on what the meaning of is. So if Paul is speaking of a heavenly kingdom and so forth, that would fit with the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, I guess it wasn't going to be earthly after all, like the Emmaus guys. Well, we had hoped he was the one to liberate Israel. Guess not. And then Jesus incognito says, you don't understand what you're saying. And he doesn't specifically get into it's heavenly, not earthly, but it's the same sort of thing. You don't have the right idea of the Messiah's mission. He didn't come to reign on earth, in which case your disappointment would be fatal. But you've just misunderstood the how of it. He did assume his messianic role, just not in a visible way. Unless you're born anew in John, you won't be able to see the kingdom of heaven. Or in Thomas, when's all this going to happen? He says, what you expect has happened. The kingdom is spread abroad upon the earth, but men don't see it. That's really the same thing. I think it's invisible or it's heavenly. It's the same sort of a cop-out, basically. And when does that happen? When there's been a gross disappointment. Could have been the death of Jesus, if you take the standard story, but it could have been the destruction of the temple. And that would make sense. And does Paul mention that? Well, in that passage in First Thessalonians, the wrath the Jews persecuted the Lord, and now they're persecuting us and you, and God's wrath has come upon them at last. What could he be talking about? I mean, what event would have signified that? The destruction of the temple. Or in Romans 9 somewhere, he's quoting passages from the Old Testament, and one of them is, let their table become a snare to them. What table? Well, the altar of the temple. It's been destroyed. So it seems to me, or even the whole idea in Romans 9 through 11, that, well, Jews have been taken out of the game at the moment, but one day they'll come back. God's got it all worked out. Well, that might be reasonable, but tell me how it could have been evident to Paul before the destruction of the temple that Jews as a whole had rejected Jesus as the Messiah. That's a little too quick. It seems to me that presupposes more time has passed. And again, that'd mean these things are written after 70.
There's a couple of super chat questions I want to get to. Dustin Elber, thank you for your super chat. No questions. Just say thanks for giving us all quality material to listen to. Great guest as usual. Well, thank you, Dustin.
Yeah, thanks.
John D, thank you for your super chat. Paul mentioned the idea of everlasting atonement for all mankind. From the sacrifice of Jesus, high priest in a perfect heavenly tabernacle, Paul imagines the body like a temple. Was the temple already destroyed in Paul's time?
Well, I think you're thinking of the Epistle to the Hebrews, but that whole thing about how there's a heavenly tabernacle that matters to us, and Jesus is there doing priestly stuff. When do people start saying things like that? Well, if they're forced to it, because that's the only temple they've got left. I mean, at Qumran, they said the perfect temple, unlike the one you backsliders defiled, it's going to come down from heaven. Of course, the New Jerusalem in Revelation is the same idea. That's the same sort of thing. It's like the earth in Hebrews. It implies the earthly temple has been destroyed. So where is the action now? It's in the heavenly temple. So I think Hebrews certainly is written after that and in the wake of it. J.C. O'Neill's book, The Theology of Acts in its historical setting, shows how a bunch of things in Acts alone imply a Zitzim Laban, right? A context where a lot of these Lucan and Acts concepts make sense, or even the atonement of Christ. That is kind of like when the rabbis say, well, you can atone for your sins by doing good deeds or by suffering with illness so that you didn't deserve. Your suffering may lead God to forgive sins. Why are you saying that? Well, because you can't have atonement sacrifices in the temple because it's gone. Would Christians even have inherited this idea that Jesus was the saving sacrifice if they weren't writing post 70 AD? The whole Christian thing may be a result of that deferral. So, that would make a lot of sense, it seems to me, in terms of this, where are we talking about in the timeline? And again, the body as the temple. You start demythologizing things when the things are no longer around.
So, when do you two date the Gospel of Marcion? I know in the past, Dr. Price, you've stated that you think that Marcion's ministry started significantly earlier. And I would like to get R.G. Price's thoughts on that to see if you two share similar views about that, or if it's or do you two have different opinions from each other?
But
Would
was
you
that
like
a question to Dr. Price?
to both of you? Would you like to go first, RG Price, and then Price can
No,
Dr. Price?
I'll let Dr. Price go first.
Okay.
Well, one of the fascinating things in your book is the implication about the dating of the Marcionite Pauline letter collection vis-a-vis Mark, because following David Oliver Smith, you're saying it looks like that Mark is borrowing stuff from the Pauline epistles, and you make it clear, I mean, explicit, that that means he must have had pretty much the whole letter canon. Well, wow, if Mark really is right after the destruction of Jerusalem, that's putting a very early date on the Pauline letter collection. Usually everybody thinks it's later, but of course, I tend to think Mark is long past the temple's destruction, though important components like the atoning death, they're probably earlier and may have come directly in the wake of the temple. So I guess it works either way. But if one dates Mark as early as people like to do, right after 70, then and if it is dependent on the letters, then you wind up pushing the letter collection back earlier. Like the reason this is important, it's like one of the big arguments against Second Peter being authentic is that the writer already knows a Pauline letter collection, right? He says Paul's okay, but he talks about this stuff in all his letters. Of course, people twist them, but if you read them right, they're okay. Wait a minute, a Pauline letter collection that is considered scripture in the lifetime of Peter? No way. And so they say this is one of the big signals that Second Peter must come from like 120 to 150.
Well, yeah, I would say I'd say Second Peter is probably even older. But I would say the writer of Second Peter knew almost every book in the Bible, in the New Testament. But there's actually parts that match with Jude and other letters of Peter and Gospels. It's sort of like the final letter that tries to tie everything all together.
Yeah,
and it's
well put.
Very likely might have been written by the person that actually put the collection together. I would think.
That's interesting. Yeah.
But yeah, you make a good point about the dating. And when I wrote my book, the Deciphering the Gospels, I wanted to try to be able to argue for early dating of this stuff. In the time since, as I'm working on a new book, I've done a ton more research, and I think my views have changed. That I was trying to just show that you could still date Mark to 70 to 80 and still understand that it as a totally made up story, that early, quote unquote, now early seeming dating doesn't do anything to lend historical reality to the story. But I think now it's probably more likely that Mark was written in the early second century or very late first. I think there's also just too much evidence that it was using Antiquity of the Jews, or at the very least Wars of the Jews, but more like Antiquity of the Jews. And that puts it after 90. And so, yeah, now that is one of the interesting things with the work of Valiant and Atwill and stuff is, there's a lot that I disagree with in their work, but I think the most important thing they point out is all of the relationships between the works of Josephus and the gospel narratives. And there is a lot of truth to that. That doesn't necessarily mean that some of the stuff that they imply, but it certainly is another indicator that whoever wrote these gospels had read those works, and that those, and that's one thing I think is, as a point in my book, is that this is all can be explained as a product of literary development. There is no real evidence of any community. There's no evidence of oral traditions. There's tons of evidence of literary construction and literary dependency all the way down. So, yeah, in terms of, and what was this question again? This question was something about dating. What was the original question? Sorry, it's about dating the Marcionite material.
If Mark was pretty early, but knew all
right.
the Pauline.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think I agree that Mark was not necessarily early. I think Mark's dependence on the Pauline letters, we have evidence for that. The date that Mark was written, we don't, or the date that the Pauline letters were written, we don't. So yes, there's dependency, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Mark was written early. So if Mark was written in 100 or 110 or 120 or 130, I don't see there's any issue there. Now, what I do think is interesting is that Marcion's supposed publication was, well, I don't know, not publication, but whatever you want to call it. His collection was a single gospel and the collection of Pauline letters. And if the Markan narrative, if what we have is the Gospel of Mark, something close to that, was really the first, and it does indeed show dependence on the Pauline letters, it would seem that that gospel must have also been bundled with the Pauline letters. And so it would make sense either whichever way, however it happened, whichever gospel was written first, that whatever gospel was first, the writer of that gospel had read the Pauline letters, knew the Pauline letters, and those two things went together hand in hand. And we see that in Marcion's collection, that he has a gospel and the Pauline letters, and that makes sense. It makes sense that the first narrative that was written used those Pauline letters, and that those two things became a collection because there was a gospel that was produced by the person that had the letters, and then they were, sort of together as a unit. And whether that was because when Marcion's gospel and letters were like that, because that was the pattern that it originated with the Markan gospel, or if Marcion's was the first, if Marcion's gospel was the first and it was not, quote unquote, the Gospel of Mark, then it surely too was still a gospel that was derived from the Pauline letters. And that is, I think, maybe an outside possibility that there was a first layer that was built more primarily on the Pauline letters and less on the scriptures. And then Mark came along and aligned it more with the scriptures. Maybe that's possible. I don't know.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, but anyways, yeah, I think the dependency is far more certain because we can see evidence of it. The dating is still, I don't know. I guess there's still roughly a 70 or 80 year span that it all could have been happened in.
Yeah, I don't think even if Mark is around 70 AD, that doesn't undermine the idea of his dependence upon a Pauline letter collection. It just raises the question of, how early did that happen?
Right.
And it could have been very early. It doesn't take long for some of these things. Some scholars have thought that Mark was the original Gospel of Marcion. Of course, Marcion is another version of the name Mark. I mean,
little Mark.
And I believe my Jesus Seminar colleague, Richard Arthur, no longer with us, sadly, I believe he thought that Mark was, I could be wrong about this, but I think I remember him saying he thought Mark was the Marcionite gospel. And one big reason to think that is the way that gospel depicts the disciples as bums and blockheads and traitors. Like, sheesh, who was saying that in the early church? Maybe it wasn't only Marcion, but he certainly is the obvious candidate.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't see Mark as a proto-Orthodox anti-Marcionite gospel. It doesn't appear to be that, unlike Matthew and Luke, which definitely do appear to be along those lines. And John, of course, appears to be some type of revision of a Gnostic gospel, like Valentinian gospel or something. And it still retains many of those sort of Gnostic elements. But do we have another super chat question, or?
As a matter of fact, we do. John Mecker, thank you for your super chat. If Paul did write after 70 and Christianity began after the destruction of the temple, what kind of implications would this have on modern Christianity?
I don't think, like with almost any of these things, if you found the tomb of Jesus with a skeleton in there, and he has a placard saying, "I am Jesus of Nazareth, the Messiah," that wouldn't, if it even penetrated into the popular consciousness. My old pastor decades ago said, if they found the bones of Jesus, would you have enough faith to believe anyway? Well, that's kind of the way it is. People's minds are made up based on upbringing and emotionalism. No argument would unseat that. They would just say, well, I don't know how that could be, but I guess when we get to heaven, in the great seminar room with the angels clearing everything up, they'll tell us. It wouldn't, if people even knew about such a thing, much less this, it wouldn't faze them. They just wouldn't care.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely true to a large extent. It would certainly have, and actually, Dr. Price, you can speak to this a heck of a lot better than me. It would certainly have an implications at the level of, seminary schools and things like that. I think it would eventually have an impact. I don't think it would like revolutionize anything in, today or anything like that, but it's something that it would then lead to reassessments at high levels that would then trickle down over hundreds of years. But it's not going to I don't think that there's much that is going to, and then the other interesting thing is right now around the world, even in America, America's been a holdout, but the sort of hold of Christianity on society, for better and worse, is waning. And I think that is another case where I'm probably a lot like Dr. Price in a lot of ways of, while I don't believe that these stories are true, I still see a lot of merit in Christian ideas and philosophies and things. Now, there's certain things that are problematic as well, but certainly in this country and in others, there's a bit of throwing out the baby with the bathwater that's happening, culturally right now, and certainly the grip of Christianity on society is loosening, but I would say not necessarily always for the better. But as to what any of those things would have an effect on popular views of Christianity today, I would say, I agree with Dr. Price, probably not much. At a higher level, though, I think, it would be pretty significant.
So thanks for that super chat, John. Let's get to the next one. John Deep, thank you for your super chat. In Marcion's gospel, Jesus seems to have directly come from heaven, but later it mentions that Jesus has a mother. What do you make of that?
It could be just a contradiction or a misreading of when Marcion says he came down to Capernaum or wherever it was in the beginning. It might be.
It was Capernaum.
Oh, okay. You know how people, how in the letter to the Hebrews, it talks about Melchizedek and says he had neither father nor mother, beginning nor end of days, but like the Son of God lives forever. Where did they get that? It doesn't say it in Genesis, but it doesn't tell you who his parents were. And so people said, oh, I guess that means he didn't have any. It's kind of stupid, but that the ancients often thought that way. Is it possible that's happened here? That Marcion was just having Jesus come on stage without any buildup? That he doesn't mean he swooped down from the sky like Superman or beamed down like Captain Kirk? I don't know. I mean, I kind of assume that is what he meant, but in light of the thing about his mother, of course.
But he denies
Superman.
that he has a mother, so it's another. That's the interesting thing, is that there's only one mention of the mother in that main body of Luke, which is presumably also in Marcion's gospel. I think it's in the reconstructions, but it's also a denial. He says, your mother and brothers are outside, and then he says, who is my mother and brothers? It's the people that So he never acknowledges actually that it even is his mother. So it's one of those things that exactly how it was interpreted by those people at that time, the 2nd century, I don't know.
Or what?
I see it as a potential denial that he had a mother, because they sort of put it out there and then he basically dismisses her, which is one of the interesting things about Luke, because, Luke 1 and 2 build up this whole thing about how wonderful Mary is, and this is this perfect mother, and Mary all over the place. And then in the rest of the Luke, all you have is this one passage where Jesus is like, she's not my mother.
Well, there's another one where in Luke where this woman calls out, "Blessed is the womb that bore you and the breasts that nursed you." And what does he say? No, rather, blessed are those who hear the word of God and do it. I mean, it's very similar to the one you point out.
Mm-hmm.
But how much of a no is it? Is he saying, you're assuming I have such a mother? How would you know? And I hadn't thought of that. Very, very cogent.
Yeah, and it's hard to know exactly how these things were. What exactly did Marcionites teach about how to interpret these passages? I don't know. All we have to go by is a few notes from anti-Marcionites, so it's hard to say.
Was he a Docetist? It kind of looks like. I mean, was Marcion and was Luke, because it kind of looks like it when they're about to throw him off the cliff and he passes through them effortlessly. Doesn't that kind of imply he doesn't have a physical body like in the Acts of John? But then on the other hand, Marcion certainly believed in the crucifixion. That Jesus died on the cross to redeem, to buy the creatures of the demiurge as adoptable by his Father instead. So I wonder if he held a view kind of like the radical reformer Caspar Schwenkfeld, who believed that that he had a real body, but it was made of star material or something. And it didn't come from human beings, but essentially it's human, as if he were an android, I guess you might.
Yeah.
We got 2 more super chat questions. Let's start with Vesper. Vesper, thank you for your super chat. Paul studied under Gamaliel, grandson of Hillel.
Question.
Yeah, I don't buy it. I think that and the whole idea that he was a Pharisee is just part of this Catholicizing attempt to create a link between him and Judaism, but who knows? Chaim Maccabee thought he was way too conservative in taking seriously New Testament narrative as historical, but he thought Paul did say this stuff in Philippians and in Acts, but he was lying. I find that really hard to accept, though I think it's fiction. It's just not Paul's idea. But he doesn't treat scripture. Like there's this highly acclaimed book by W.D. Davies, certainly a great scholar, but in his book, Paul and Rabbinic Judaism, he tries to show how Paul's ideas are related in Judaism. And the closest he comes, in my opinion, was where he says this idea of the evil Yetzer, the Yetzer Hara, this pulling towards sin that everybody has. That's kind of like Pauline thought, but I don't think it is. And I thought this whole book was like, what does it say? The mountain labored and brought forth a mouse. It was like so little he was able to prove. Whereas Maccabee instead says, no, if you want to see an analogy to Paul in ancient scripture interpretation, look at the Nag Hammadi texts, because it's very different. And even the stuff that sounds like Jewish midrashic lore, like Christ was the rock that followed Moses and the children of Israel, and the water came from it. Maccabee says that was well known in Hellenistic diaspora Judaism. That doesn't imply he had rabbinic training. And the scene where Gamaliel actually appears in Acts, I think chapter 5, this is obviously, I mean, screamingly obviously, based Josephus and Euripides. Don't kick against, don't be found fighting against God. It's like Tiresias in the Bacchae. So I just don't think there's sufficient evidence for that. It's just trying to make him Jewish.
Right. Yeah.
Did you want to address that question, RG Price?
No, it's the interesting thing about so much of this stuff is even hearing many other people that have studied a lot of this material for a long time. There's just seems to be a real lack of acknowledgement or lack of willingness to accept the idea that writers made stuff up. Mm-hmm. And there's almost there's whenever anything is in any of these stories, there seems to be a strong desire for people to think that this idea must have come from somewhere outside of the writer's brain. But how many novels and stories have been written by writers that okay, to what degree does something have to be influenced by reality to be based on reality? I don't know, but I mean, so many of this, Acts especially, is clearly, majorly a contrivance of the writer who has a very clear agenda, and they're trying to position Paul in a very specific way, and that writer is inventing these scenes, and a lot of these relationships and all these stuff, they're the invention of the writer. There's not necessarily a single second of tradition behind it that anybody taught anything or thought anything. This was the writer made it up.
Yeah. People are tempted to fall for the magic of narrative. They want to believe it. And this is why Shakespeare in his plays had to title them things like The True History of Richard III or whatever, because there was a predisposition of people to say, well, if it says it happened, it must have happened. And for people that knew better to say that if you're making up a narrative, you are lying. And so he had to pretend that it was true. I once had a student who we were talking about the parables, and I said, it's not like Jesus is a newscaster and the prodigal son, he got this out of the Galilee Gazette because it actually happened. No, he made the story up like Aesop's fables as a vehicle to teach. This student said, you're calling Jesus a liar, and you're going to answer for it on the day of judgment. Like, how do you not know what a parable is? Look it up in the dictionary. But there people are tempted. I mean, she's an extreme case, but it's not uncommon.
One quick note: I've got to drop here shortly, so I got about a couple more minutes. So,
yeah, I'm turning the stream off after the next super chat because I gotta go too.
Okay.
Dustin Elliver, thank you for your super chat. The only thing that makes me think the Gospels were written closely prior or post 70 AD are the quotes saying that generation would still be alive at the coming. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it was, once it was debunked by the cold facts of history, it was too late to erase it. And the practice of scribes appears to have been, if they didn't believe something, if they thought something in scripture was wrong, they would instead add on another statement that would basically function to say, disregard that. I know what you're thinking, but that's not what it meant. What does Jesus say right after that? This generation shall not pass away before all these things have happened. But as to that day and hour, nobody knows. Even I don't know. Even the angels don't know. Why would he say that? I mean, I can think of a reason, but it just sounds like, and you got the same thing in the Quran, where Muhammad is said to have said that the day of judgment is soon at hand, and then it's followed by, of course, nobody really knows when. It just seems obvious that people did that. In fact, that happens several times in Mark alone, which implies a rather late date for Mark, in my opinion. But here's the main alternative to that, which I think is to be taken seriously. James Valiant and Joe Atwill, they say that it may be that they're trying to redeem the horrible destruction of the temple and the city by Titus, by disguising it in biblical terminology, and that it did happen. They're not, that they weren't really talking about Jesus, the Son of Man, coming back to smash the temple like Godzilla, but rather that a Son of Man could be anybody, and it was Titus. Especially since there were Jews and Romans who already thought Vespasian or Titus was the Jewish Messiah. So that's possible. We may have been misreading that one, just like you said about the Pauline stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly what exactly is meant by this coming. Is that the war and the destruction of the temple? Is that what was really being forecast? Of course, which did happen within that generation. So, yeah. But here's another thing too, and this is probably less satisfying for people, but the reality is that when you look, and this is in the new book that I'm working on, I go into a whole lot of information about Greek and Roman and other non-biblical Jewish writings of the time, specifically prophetic writings. And the reality is that there was extensive use of the creation of these prophetic writings and narratives and stories about things that were supposed to have been foretold and all this kind of stuff, and it was quite sophisticated. And many people, the Roman Senate, emperors and stuff, were fooled by many of these writings that profess to be from Orpheus and the Sibyls and all these things that claim to predict all these various stuff. And in fact, the Roman Senate had soothsayers and stuff in the employ of the Senate that would advise them before they would vote on things, and they would use prophetic writings as a part of how they would make their decisions and stuff. And so there was a lot of sophistication on how to write works that tricked people into believing that they were written at a time that they weren't written, and that they could forecast things that couldn't have been known at that time. And there's hundreds of examples of it, and many examples of people being fooled by it. And I think absolutely that those types of techniques and stuff include things like intentionally throwing people off the trail by intentionally doing some things that seem not quite right, and predicting some things that could be interpreted in multiple ways. Even though you could be more precise, don't be too precise, because then that'll give away your hand. And so a lot of these things were done, and we know that they were done, and classicists and classical historians have no problem identifying all this stuff in literature outside the Bible. When you get into the Bible, it gets real tricky and nobody wants to acknowledge it. But there was a lot of use of these literary techniques to fool people into thinking that works were written prior to the time they were written, and it was done on purpose. And again, they were smart enough to know that you don't just reveal your hand and precisely predict stuff and do stuff real obvious, because then everybody knows it's fake. And so they did a lot of these techniques of making it interpretable, a little bit foggy, so that it wasn't obvious that it was a fake and that it was written when it was. And so that's another possibility with that type of passage, is that the writer wanted people to think that this could have been written prior to the destruction of the temple and that it was being foretold. They didn't want him to think that he knew too much about what actually happened.
Yeah, the Oracle of Delphi was vague. If you engage in battle with so-and-so, a great empire will fall. Oh, boy, that must mean my enemy. Well,
yeah. All right. Well, with that one, I've got to go, but it's been a great pleasure talking with you, Dr. Price.
Yeah. Thank you both thank you both for joining me today, and I'll see everybody later. And I want to thank everybody again for super chatting their questions. It helps me continue my work. And I'll see everybody later. Thanks again.
Okay.
And thanks, Jacob.
Merry Christmas, everyone.
Yep. Merry Christmas.
Yeah.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.